Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're zooming in from. I'm Jeremy Hafner, Chancellor here at the University of Denver, and it's my delight to kick us off for the very first Denver Dialogues event. I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank, of course, our esteemed guests that are with us today. Robert Doar, Dan Porterfield, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, and Anne-Marie Slaughter for joining us. I look forward, and I think many of us in the audience all do, to hearing your thoughts on a topic that is so deeply important to the University of Denver, to all the universities and colleges across our country, and to our society as a whole. A little bit of background. Across the university, faculty, students, and staff are thinking big about how we can all engage more thoughtfully, authentically, and respectfully with one another, and with challenging evidence-based ideas. Essentially, how can we really embrace a civil discourse environment? I'm proud to say that the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies and the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy has come forward with the Denver Dialogues, one very new, exciting way that the university can engage with complex topics together as an academic community. Now, over the year, on campus and virtually, we will invite thought leaders from 4 nationally recognized think tanks. These individuals that represent it, in fact, they are some of our finest think tanks across our country, to speak on complex issues. I actually hope that you will disagree with some of their opinions. I hope that you might passionately agree with some of them. But either way, I have no doubt we will all learn something about an issue impacting the world, about our own perspectives and values, and about the experiences or ideas of others. But more importantly, I hope we walk away with renewed muscle strength in the ability to listen across differences. Now, why does this matter? It matters deeply because conversations matter, and because conversations are at the heart of open inquiry, which is at the very core of what we do at universities and colleges. Since my inauguration as chancellor, I have committed the University of Denver to be a beacon for intellectual curiosity, for free speech, academic freedom, and thought pluralism. We do this and we affirm these values because they are critical and central to the functioning of democracy. But moreover, they are essential to the advancement of knowledge and learning, the very heart of what we do at a university. And civil discourse, like we will see today, ensures we are engaging with voices and perspectives that are different from our own. A little caveat there. Civil discourse is the vehicle by which we have conversations. Free speech is the principle by which we allow all of us to share our thoughts, but we actually need to have differing ideas to really engage in these difficult conversations. So that's where pluralism comes in. And this is central to our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. And it always ensures that there's a seat open at the table. At Denver Dialogues, and in all our work and interactions, let us continue to open pathways for voices and ideas from all backgrounds. And let's truly empathetically listen. Let's learn from these experiences and perspectives that perhaps we don't personally share. And let us model for all of our students the power and purpose of civil discourse so they can thrive here at the University of Denver, and of course, once that they graduate. After all, our world is not intellectually, politically, spiritually, or culturally homogeneous, nor will it ever be. As another organization that I admire in this space often says, great minds don't always think alike. It is this bountiful diversity of thought, of experiences, of perspectives and ideas that make the world and all of us so deeply interesting and inspiring. So we'll be curious, we'll be empathetic, we'll be respectful. At Denver Dialogues, but also in our classrooms. We'll be curious when we meet together in conversation. We'll be empathetic when we encounter an idea that challenges us. And we'll be respectful when someone raises their hand and says, I see that differently. I hope you join us for each of the Denver Dialogues events. And I hope you take away from each conversation more knowledge and more empathy. Thanks again to the Corbell School and the Scrivener Institute for Public Policy for making this possible. And now I'd like to turn it over to Corbell School Dean and passionate supporter of civil discourse himself, Dr. Fritz Meyer.
Well,
Fritz?
thank you, Jeremy, and thanks for that great kickoff and introduction. And let me add my welcome to all of you joining us today. We are so excited to be launching the Denver Dialogues, as Jeremy said, a partnership between the Corbell School and 4 of America's leading think tanks: the Hoover Institution, the Aspen Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and New America, all of whom are engaged in and modeling civil discourse about major issues facing our nation and the world. You know, it's hard to think of a more important issue in this country, and indeed around the world, than the deterioration of the civic culture on which democracy depends. A fundamental requirement of a democracy is that while we may disagree vehemently about what is to be done, we accept the legitimacy of those with whom we disagree, and of the process through which we decide our common fate. Even when we don't reach consensus, underlying everything is consensus that if our position doesn't prevail, we will accept the results and work to prevail in the future. And it depends on civil discourse. Now, civil discourse need not be genteel. Civil disobedience of the civil rights movement was a form of civil discourse. And mere civility isn't enough. Appeals to civility can be used to silence protests. That's not what we have in mind. We need to hear all voices, and we need robust disagreement. Now, this is not the first moment when we've been divided as a nation, but we are at a deeply divided moment in America, in which red America is getting redder and blue bluer. And the tenor of the discourse has descended into deep distrust and a willingness to believe absurd narratives, language of us and them rather than of we. A loss of faith in e pluribus unum. It's a perilous moment in some ways for our democracy. Yet in Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, spoken as the United States was indeed coming apart, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. So that's the spirit in which we launched the Denver Dialogues, here in a purple state in the heart of the country. It's part of our commitment to robust, respectful exchange, to relearning how to speak with and to listen to others who see things differently. And our hope here is to contribute in some small way to touching the better angels of our nature. To discuss the state of civil discourse in America and to help us launch the Denver Dialogues are the leaders of our 4 partners. Each has a remarkable biography, which I can't possibly do justice to in this introduction, and each has a remarkable institution. Robert Doar is president of the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. AEI describes itself as dedicated to bolstering free enterprise and innovation, strengthening our communities, defending our nation's founding values, and revitalizing the foundations of American defense. Prior to serving as president, Mr. Doar was for more than 20 years in leadership positions in social services programs in New York State and New York City government. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
Dan Porterfield is the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute describes itself as a global nonprofit organization committed to realizing a free, just, and equitable society. Its myriad programs span the gamut of issues from community development to climate change. Previously, Dr. Porterfield was president of Franklin and Marshall College, and he has held major positions at other universities in the U.S. government. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Fritz. Great to be here.
Condoleezza Rice is director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a professor at Stanford University. Hoover describes itself as seeking to secure and safeguard peace, improve the human condition, and limit government intrusion into the lives of individuals. Dr. Rice served as the 66th U.S. Secretary of State from 2005 to 2009 and as National Security Advisor from 2001 to 2005. She was provost at Stanford University from 1993 to 1999. And most importantly, Secretary Rice is an alumna of the University of Denver and of the Korbel School. Welcome, Condi.
Great to be with you, Fritz.
And Anne-Marie Slaughter is the CEO of New America. New America describes itself as a think and action tank dedicated to renewing the promise of America, bringing us closer to the nation's highest ideals, honestly confronting the challenges caused by rapid technological and social change, and seizing the opportunities those changes create. Previously, Dr. Slaughter was Dean of Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, and subsequently was Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. Welcome, Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Fritz. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, an absolutely extraordinary panel. Thank you all for being with us today. And joining me as moderator for the Denver Dialogues and my partner in envisioning and establishing this series is my colleague, Professor Nazneen Barma, director of our Doug and Mary Scribner Institute of Public Policy here at the Korbel School. Naz, I'm so looking forward to working with you on this project. So welcome, Naz.
Thank you, Fritz, and thank you to our extraordinary panel. I'm delighted to be here with you all today, and a special thank you to AEI, Aspen, Hoover, and New America for partnering with us on this incredibly exciting new initiative. Also joining us are over 600 viewers. That's how many we had registered from across DU, Denver, and our broader community today. I'd like to just give a quick reminder to everyone that we are indeed open for questions, which we'll get to in the second part of our session today. Please do submit those anytime. I'd like to give a special shout out to the student watch party being hosted today at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies. And I mention our students explicitly because one of our central ideas in envisioning the Denver Dialogues is to be really intentional about hosting the series at a university, with particular attention to the co-curricular dimensions of the work that we'll be doing. We're going to be planning across campus over the course of the academic year and beyond to hold continuing conversations in the classroom and on campus about the content and spirit of the Denver Dialogues as part of the university's broader commitment to civil discourse, as Chancellor Hafner elaborated. We're here to listen to our panelists, so without further ado, I'd like to turn to our panel for a rapid round to begin with, to get us all talking, and to start by helping us define the problem that we're all here to address via this partnership. So Condi, I'd like to start with you, please, by asking the question, what is the nature of the civil discourse problem in the United States today? What's your diagnosis of where we are? And if there's someone to blame, who is that?
Well, first of all, thanks very much to Denver, the University of Denver, for doing this. This is a critical moment. We don't listen to each other anymore. And if you can't listen, then you can't begin to hear where your interests might come together and where solutions might come from. Instead, everyone seems to go to their corner. I think it's exacerbated by, but not caused by, the way that we get our information these days. We get our information in groups, affinity groups with which we feel very comfortable. I can today go to my website, I can go to my aggregators and go to my cable news channel. I never have to actually encounter anyone who thinks differently. And when I do then finally encounter someone who thinks differently, I think they're either stupid or venal. And so somehow we've got to start opening our minds, and I would say opening our hearts a little bit, to hear how others are perceiving an issue, how others are seeing solutions. And then maybe we'll have a chance to talk about those solutions in what we call a civil way. But I think democratic politics, the policy of democracy is, as Madison once called it, contestation, But to have a contest, it means you have to have at least two sides. And right now, too much, we live in one-sided worlds.
Thank you, Condi, for reminding us at the outset that this is indeed about hearts and minds. Robert, let me turn to you for your diagnosis of the problem today.
Well, I think Condi got it exactly right. We're retreating to our corners, and the fringes are dominating the dialogue, and the social media world exacerbates that by feeding into and promoting the most sort of angry responses from people that participate in that. So I think that plays a role. I would want to particularly compliment you guys at the university, because I think part of the problem is on our college campuses, and that there hasn't been sufficient viewpoint diversity, and there has been too much shutting down of people who say things that are contrary to the prevailing view. And I think that you have to be purposeful. You have to be celebrating and talking about things that once seemed obvious and almost cliche, but because I think higher education in a broader way has forgotten some of these values and allowed the fringes to dominate the discussion, we got to go back to basic tenets. We got to be quoting Lincoln, as Fritz did. And when you hear Lincoln, you think, oh my goodness, but that's the state the country's in. We've got to go back to Lincoln and the founders and begin to rebuild confidence in our institutions and a willingness to engage in debate with people who have different viewpoints.
The powerful metaphor that you've both put on the table of people retreating to their corners and the fringes sort of having the space, as it were. Anne-Marie, what's your diagnosis of what ails us today?
So I will build on the diagnosis of not listening and of essentially talking only to ourselves. So even if we were disposed to listen, we are not in spaces where we are actually being exposed to people who disagree with us in a way that allows us to talk rather than shout or simply defend. I'll say a couple of other things. One is that it's not important just to listen. One of the most important lessons I've learned as a leader, and I hope as a citizen, is you can't persuade unless you're willing to be persuaded. And I will certainly say this is true as a parent. If your child doesn't think they can convince you of anything, you are not going to make headway. You can force them, but you're not going to persuade them. And that means coming at any discourse or dialogue or conversation with an open enough mind to think, I'm listening and I'm willing to change my mind. Maybe not my core principles, but I'm willing to let you persuade me. And in return, you're more likely to let me persuade you. I think that's something we've lost. The other thing I would add, and I do think cable news is partly responsible for this, is the overwhelming salience of our political identities. Mm-hmm. So we look at people as red or blue. And I will take Condi as an example. She and I are from different parties, but I see Condi as a leader. I see her as an academic. I know her as a football fan. I know that she plays piano. Those are all facets of who she is that I see, and in many places allow us to come together or at least learn from one another. And when you have 24-hour political news where you have people who have a stake in essentially erasing all those other identities, that's not going to work. Democracies require what we call cross-cutting cleavages, right? Ways in which we disagree, but ways in which we can also find similarities. And I think that is very much lacking, an ability to come together with different identities.
Thank you. That's a really, I think, a crucial juxtaposition between our kind of tendency to sort of retreat into these tribal identities versus the need really for openness, as you kind of started out elaborating. Dan, what's your diagnosis of the civil discourse problem in the US today?
Well, I like everything that was said, and I like that Secretary Rice used the word exacerbated, because we do have forces in our society, whether it's technology or the role of some in the media or some in political life, that make the problem worse. The reality is that the problem lives within the human spirit ourselves. We are the problem, because all humans have a tendency to gravitate towards what makes us comfortable or to move away from what we fear. this is one of the things we all have to learn in our schooling and our family upbringing and our community life, is how to deal with our own vulnerability in such a way it doesn't prevent us from engaging with others. And then if we do have those tendencies, which are human, to be able to understand that and factor that into how we process new information or efforts to manipulate us. One other part of the problem I want to call out is that there's a lot of good, serious dialogue happening in community all around the country. I'm sure on the Denver campus, all around the country. And often the people that are in community, typically on the ground, framing and solving problems together, getting something done, they're not always looked at and celebrated as the cultural norm. And I do think part of all of our work in our different ways is to make sure that the spotlight is on those individuals, because they're the ones that are actually living American ideals right now. They're not vanished. They're just not necessarily celebrated as much as they could be.
So let me thank you all for those interventions and at least in sort of kicking us off, and obviously a really rich topic. Each of you referenced, among other things, the media and the sort of information ecosystem that we find ourselves in, and the way in which this seems to be contributing to the tribalism, to the tribal identity. I'm curious sort of how we, where do we intervene in this? I mean, to the extent, and it may not be the only problem, and as you say, Dan, it's exacerbating other human tendencies, but we do seem to be in a world in which we live in bubbles, and we are, as Condi started off the conversation saying, we hear what we want to hear, and AI is making it even worse, right? They've figured out how to feed us stuff that we want to hear. But as you look at the landscape of just to focus on that one issue for the moment, where do you see the points of intervention? What do we do differently to combat this tendency, if it is such an important part of what's driving the problem? And maybe we'll come back around. Well, anyone could jump in, but maybe come back around to Condi again and ask each of you to reflect on that.
Well, I think this is a hard one, because if you're in the media, you want ratings, you want viewers, you want eyeballs. And we know that what gets viewers, ratings, and eyeballs is actually not considered conversation, but rather the loudest voice. And so it's hard, but if I could wave a magic wand, I would say something to the consumer of news, and I would say something to the consumer of information, and something to the providers of information. So first, to the consumers, don't become captive of one view. I'm often asked by my students, what do you read in the morning? I said, I probably read 5 different newspapers. I go to several different news services, because I know that I'm going to get a slant in one or the other. And until I can do something about that, it's my responsibility as an informed citizen to make sure that I'm getting a well-rounded view of the problem. And I'm especially careful when I have strong views about something, that I try and go and read the strongest views on the other side. I have to admit, makes me mad, takes my blood pressure up, but it's the only way that I can assure that I'm not living in a bubble. And since I'm constantly telling my students, if you're in the company of people who say amen to everything you say, find other company, then I have to practice that too. So to the consumers of information, you have a responsibility. Don't just sit and blame the media. You have a responsibility to seek out other views. And then to the providers, could we finally get back, and maybe this shows that I'm just an old person, when we had those trusted Walter Cronkites and those trusted David Brinkleys, who seemed to at least give us the news as straight as they could we find a line between commentary, which can look one way, and news, which should look another. But until that happens, maybe there's more responsibility on me, the consumer of information, to make sure that I'm getting a well-rounded view.
So a lot there, and on both sides, as a consumer, what we can do as individuals, and where the producers may go. Yeah, Robert.
I would also say that, it's, first of all, I completely agree on the consumers. We give the same talk to young people that you really need to start every day by consuming media from multiple sources and multiple viewpoints, or you really aren't ready to do your job or be successful, at least at AI. And I think it's a great habit to have, to really broaden your readership, your reading every morning. But I also think some of it is on the way in which we behave in our various institutions and the ways you all behave at universities. We try hard to have events where we feature a viewpoint, but we also like to feature a counter viewpoint. We want to make sure there are people who disagree and are challenging us so we can refine our arguments better. We don't like to have, it's not always possible to have an event where we're all, singing from the same hymn book. That's no fun, and we don't really think people that consume our product like that. Similarly, on college campuses, I think a greater effort needs to be made to bring viewpoint diversity. I happen to think that balance is tilted to the left in most college campuses among faculties, and I think university presidents need to do an even harder job to find different viewpoints and bring them to campus so that students see both viewpoints, so different viewpoints and a more conservative. So there is viewpoint diversity. So I think it's not all on the media or the social media. They play a big role in this problem, but and the last one, as I would say, is the broad middle of individuals who, in the wake of this antagonism from the left and the right, retreat and stay silent. I've had two sons who recently graduated from college, and I would hear from them, well, I just decided to just do my homework and not participate in the public debate. And I find that to be regrettable too. You've got to step up. You can't be afraid to say something and maybe be wrong and participate in the public debate, write an op-ed. And I think sometimes young people are a little too careerist in thinking, well, if I say anything, it might be held against me later. And I feel that's a real shame. And so it's on all of us to model the behavior that we aspire to.
A good challenge to all of us, and certainly we're aspiring to do that here today, and the other things that we're doing. Anne-Marie, I know you and your colleagues at New America think a lot about state of democracy, and I think also about the media and the information environment. I'm curious how you respond to this.
Well, I will say I want to reinforce Candy's point about a kind of news literacy, which I would also strengthen by talking about digital literacy, because it's bad enough when we are reading different papers and if it's on the internet, it must be true, right? So some of this is so exacerbated by the rabbit holes you can now go down. And then, of course, we're entering the era of deep fakes, where you're going to see, I'm going to see one of you saying something that you didn't say, which means when we think about teaching civics, and this is pre-university, but also at university, digital literacy, and I would say information literacy broadly, we need to think very hard about how we make people appropriately skeptical without making them deeply cynical. And that's a line, that's a hard line, because otherwise you just turn off completely. So I would strongly second that. And Candy, I admire your discipline in being able to read things that are going to raise your blood pressure. That does go against human nature in many ways. So then the second thing I would say is we need different archetypes of strength and confidence and power. Meaning, and this is hard because many of us here have gotten where we are because we have good judgment. I'm trained as a lawyer. I never listen to only one side of the story. I know there's another side of the story, but I spend a lot of money learning, to think that way. That makes me sort of in the middle often. It makes me balanced. That is less attractive than somebody who's got all the answers on one side or the other. But I think we can lift up people who I'm thinking now of, I'm forgetting her name, Loretta Ross, who's a professor at Smith, who talks about calling people in rather than calling people out, about actually valuing those who don't simply put others down, but try to have discourse. So I think we could raise up different kinds of heroes. The last thing I'll say, just to inject a little disagreement and to practice what we preach. So to Bob, I agree with having people who have different views. But I will say that universities have been traditionally more on the left. They simply are. It's just a fact that more university faculty across all universities, not just the big universities we often think of, are more to the left. But then, of course, Wall Street is more to the right, right? We have other big sectors of society that are definitely biased in a more conservative direction and a more liberal direction. And I think you're right about universities, but I would make the same challenge to my good friends in the finance industry, many good friends in business, some of my friends in the tech world who are deeply libertarian. I think it can't just be a challenge to universities. We are charged with educating our young people, but some of these other sectors are forming our young adults, our medium, or, our middle adults and our voters.
Well, thanks for interjecting some disagreement. I'm going to try to probe that in a minute, but thanks for your reflections, Dan. I was struck by you talked about the virtues of things that are happening at the local level and the sort of in-person kind of engagements that are possible. And I wondered if you might want to sort of take, riff on that a bit further, because I started this by talking about the media and the sort of kind of the anonymous social media phenomenon that we see, in which people are willing to say almost anything. But I'm curious if part of the solution isn't those kinds of conversations that take place in a more intimate, personal way.
Well, thank you. I think that has to be the foreground of community life, is actual person-to-person interaction. Whatever else we can achieve on the margins by being able to connect virtually and digitally. I have an answer to that. Let me say one thing about the left, right, center in American institutions. I do think that a professor has a responsibility. I don't think I'm making a disagreement here, but to be inclusive and impartial. Whatever their personal viewpoint might be out there in the world, effective teaching demands that kind of inclusive, expert, and impartial, and both in the content and in the method of managing the classroom. I imagine that's an agreed upon point. So hiring more liberal or more conservative professors, to me, is something to try to do if you don't have balance. But the first thing is, are people professional in how they conduct their work, whether it's research, teaching, or developing a syllabus. In terms of this more local level, participatory, community-oriented democracy, the engagement of one-to-one, one-to-two together to understand one another, it actually is a practice that America has been great at for hundreds of years. And in most communities, there are people that we call them at the Aspen Institute weavers, that are intentionally and effectively reweaving community, sometimes not because they're focusing on the need for the community to weave, but on solving a problem. And it might be in one neighborhood is that kids have nowhere to go after school, and so a mom opens up her house. And another neighborhood, it might be that people from different religious backgrounds are not finding any opportunity to talk to each other, and somebody creates a book club. And that's happening a lot. My colleague at the Aspen Institute, Eric Liu, has a big TED Talk that's about his idea that we don't need fewer arguments, we need better arguments. And what are the principles of a better argument? I won't give a whole lecture, but it includes, taking winning off the table at the start to try to get to understanding, trying to prioritize relationships, and as I think Secretary Rice said, listening empathetically, caring about, embracing sort of what's the context in which we're talking. What have you just experienced? How can I know where you're standing today? Being vulnerable, being honest, being open, it's a risk, but it makes the dialogue better. And sometimes those good principles end up not being about a debate, but about a discovery that people make through conversation of something that they never thought they would even be talking about or coming to understand. really good dialogue creates something new that often neither party might have come to alone. Well, anyway, my colleague Eric Liu has a TED Talk where he challenges people, especially students, to think about how to have better arguments.
Yeah. Could I just, Fritz, if I
Absolutely.
may, just in the spirit of trying to make things a little spicier, I'll say that
Oh,
Um,
excellent.
I think that Dan's idyllic classroom is exactly right. That the faculty member's responsibility is to teach our students how to think, not what to think, and we shouldn't impose our own views. I don't think that is sometimes the classroom of today, and I
No.
think we have to admit,
No.
if that were the classroom of today, we wouldn't have MIT having an entire panel or committee to discuss the issue, or the Chicago principles, or some of the things we've said at Stanford. Because the truth of the matter is there is a chill in many classrooms today. Not only do students not speak up, as you mentioned, Bob, but they say things they don't actually believe. Now, I studied places that do that. I don't want to live in one. And they will say what they need to say just to get by. That's a problem for us in universities. And I think if we don't recognize that it is a problem, now it's not every classroom. As a matter of fact, I would think that it's the great majority of classrooms that I'm familiar with look more like what Dan was talking about. But there are some places, and some, maybe it's in certain disciplines, I don't know, where students speak of the chill. And I say two things to my students about this. One is, you actually, I value your opinions, but not your uninformed ones. So don't come in and tell me how you feel. I really don't care. I would like to know what you know. And the second point that I often make is, you actually don't have a constitutional right not to be offended. Now, nobody wants to offend, but if you were offended by someone, before you mobilize the university on White Plaza, why don't you turn to the person next to you and say, you know, that was offensive, and here's why it was offensive. And can we talk about the context and the history of why that was offensive? And so I think if we could get to that place, because I'm afraid we, in too many cases, we don't have, I'll call it Dan's idyllic classroom.
So I'll engage.
I thought you might.
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting because as Condi was talking, you know, there's an element even here among the four of us, the six of us, where, you know, it's easier to agree than disagree, because disagreement is or differences of understanding can get, you know, Condi, you said spicy or hot, and so your tendency is to find what you agree with and not what you disagree with. But I'm just remembering, as you were talking, I started my career at the University of Chicago Law School, and the University of Chicago Law School, almost by the standards of academia, is well to the right, which doesn't, that is not necessarily true in the overall world. And there, it was the sort of more liberal professors, and there's liberal and there's left liberal, whatever. I put myself squarely center left, and we felt very much that we had to put both, you know, sides on the table. And I would bend over backwards to present a set of arguments that I didn't necessarily believe in, because I believe my students should hear them. That was not always true of some of my law and economics colleagues who thought they had the truth and kind of presented it as such. And I think and just to point out that it isn't only on the left, it's also been true on the right. I do agree that we have a real problem with people not feeling that they can speak. I also have two sons who just graduated from college, and I have heard from many students that they are scared that they will be canceled, that they are scared that they can't really say what they think. And so I understand that. And I also agree with Condi's point that we ought to openly talk about why something is offensive, and do it in a way that presumes good intent, that presumes you didn't intend to offend me, you just didn't understand. Learning is a big part of it. But I will also say that I think there are voices being heard who themselves felt silenced for a very long time. They may not understand how best to engage. And I often think the loudest and most militant voice silences other people of color, other people of different sexual orientations. But I think if we're not going to make progress unless we recognize that people who have long felt they couldn't say what they think now want to say what they think. And in the process, some of them are saying, yeah, I'm fine if we silence you. Well, so, too bad. We've got to be striving for an environment in which everyone can actually say what they think, but that we don't kind of call names or call people out in either direction.
I agree, but I will say this, Anne-Marie. Whenever I hear, there were people who've been long silenced, all right? Yeah, I grew up in segregated Birmingham.
Yeah, I know you did.
I understand that. But I will say this. I always say, can you model Nelson Mandela instead? This is somebody who, after 27 years in prison, came out and did say, well, now Blacks are in control, and so we're going to oppress whites, right? He said, we're going to have a multi-ethnic South Africa. So as voices that have been in the past silent start to speak up, as people who've been marginalized in the past start to speak up, you don't have to take the stance of those who marginalized you just because now you get to speak. And I think we need to be very clear that it's not okay because you were once marginalized to marginalize others now.
I agree with you, Condi. I do. And I think, you have a particular legitimacy and ability to say that. And I think there are people, younger people, who agree. And I think they themselves are actually also intimidated. And I will say this even from the context of a feminist, where I might have disagreed at various points, but I didn't want to break ranks and I didn't know how. And again, I think what was one of the point that Dan was making about how to have a better argument is also a set of tools that we need, and how that's a great response. I think we need to arm people with the ability to have better conversations.
Right.
Well, this is jump in. Yeah, I don't want to. This is a great conversation on a thorny issue that we're all, certainly those of us in academia, are facing. Yes, please.
Well, I was lucky because I went to college at Georgetown University, Jesuit institution, and it's a Catholic institution, and it really understands its role as facilitating the widest exchange of views. And so there's not a Catholic view, that is sort of more available at Georgetown, but you can get it. But anybody can come and speak if they're invited by students or professors, and they can take issue with church teaching on different matters. And that creates an environment where the students are challenged to think, because they're in the experience. Wait a minute, I go to a Catholic school. How come somebody's talking here who doesn't espouse Catholic teaching? And they think, well, what's the purpose of a university? And these more moments of some controversy can be great teaching moments. What we challenged our faculty to do at Franklin and Marshall was to develop a speech and expression policy, which we did, and it was like the Chicago principles. We started with them and made a few modifications, but more important than adopting them was that the faculty taught them in their classes. Everybody did, and they went over them. Why did we make this change? Why do we think this is important? And then when a test came, when someone invited a very controversial speaker who was allowed to speak, the students did indeed protest, but the protest was, as you had said at the beginning, civil. They mainly asked questions. Nobody shouted him down. It went on for hours, but it was a dialogue, hard, but growthful. And so I think it's so important, I guess, to say that this conversation about speech and about allowing and facilitating different opinions should happen ideally before there's a controversy, so that the controversy becomes the teaching opportunity to then say, how do we live this in practice?
Yeah. And I love that, this conversation, of course, there are differences of views here in terms of the sort of the weight of the problem being one left or right. But what's wonderful is it's a dialogue and a rich one amongst all of you. and certainly a challenge to all of us in the academy. We could go in a lot of directions here with this group. I did want to turn, if I could, quickly, and I know we want to get to some audience questions too, but it's kind of the so what question, which is, so we've been talking about the academy, obviously, and how and it matters in terms of the atmosphere on campus and the kinds of skills that our students have in this next generation that is charged with solving the problems we're leaving them. But the question is sort of, so what? In the sense of, what are the ways in which the state of civil discourse in this country, and indeed elsewhere around the world, is really inhibiting our ability as a country, as a community, to address the big issues of the time, whether they're the great issues of in the international arena and the role of the U.S. in the world, or economic inequality, economic opportunity, etc. So jump, talk to me. Take one of those issues. Go ahead, jump in.
So I'll take one. The area of poverty reduction, or helping people move out of difficult circumstances in the United States or around the world, are complicated. They're not simple. They require a multifaceted approach. They require thinking clearly about the condition of individuals, the state of the community, state of the culture, the state of the economy. If we're trapped in simplistic antagonism from two extremes, we're never going to get to the complexities that often lead to solutions that have appeal to both sides. I'm certainly not someone who's always looking to split the middle and find the consensus, but the fact of the matter is that unless you have that kind of dialogue with people who see the issue differently, or bring to the table facts that you aren't recognizing or not paying attention to, you can't solve problems. And so I think that's the so what. The so what is when we're so divided, we can't reason and think anew and together in the way we have in the past to solve hard challenges. And so I think that's the problem. We're told every day that all of our problems are simple and easy. And if you just did this one thing, or how can they be so boneheaded? But the fact of the matter, if you've had any experience in public policy, in domestic policy or foreign policy, actually, no, they're not simple. They're complicated. And in order to solve complicated problems, we have to reason together.
Yeah. And I think you have to take, I love that. And I think you have to take the time to do it.
Yeah.
And I'll give you two other downsides. And by the way, we at think tanks, we at universities, on the other side from our students are people called faculty or researchers or senior fellows. And, we really are trying. I think people are trying at Hoover, at AEI, other places. Research really ought to start with a question, not an answer.
Yeah.
And if you start with a question, and then you are clear about what your assumptions are, you're clear about what data you're using, you might actually set up an opportunity to talk to somebody who disagrees, because you can come from different places, but you're starting from the same place, which is we're asking a question that needs to be answered. We're not providing an answer a priori. It also goes back a little bit to the students. I laugh that when my students think if they've Googled it, they've researched it. And I have to explain to them that there's something more in depth there. So some of it is how those of us charged with answering these questions actually think about our responsibilities. It's not to just put more heat on, it's to shed some light. And then I would make one other point about the so what. It then gets reflected in the way that Washington in particular operates. One thing that's very interesting, we have a state and local practice here at Hoover, and it's very interesting. If you get mayors in the same room or you have governors in the same room, it's very different, because they've actually got to balance a budget. They've got to solve a problem. They have to reach across the aisle if they're going to get legislation. And the Washington environment is, I know the answer. I'm going to go to my corner. I'm going to mobilize my base, and I'm going to speak to my base, and the rest of you, well, you really don't matter. And then what happens is not only do you not get good policy answers, but you get a really, I think something that's really killing us in terms of it. People start to lose confidence in our institutions. And every time somebody doesn't agree with you, well, they are attacking democracy. It's not that they just don't agree. It's that they're being anti-democratic. And I have to say, I think that's a much more Washington thing. It's one reason I'm glad I live in California. It's much more of a Washington thing, but it is, that is the so what really is. You don't get good policy. People are afraid to compromise. They go to their corners, they mobilize their base, and they don't think about the broad middle, actually, that would like a solution.
Yeah, and we've seen this on issue after issue. I know, Dan, you do quite a bit of work on climate change at Aspen, and we just had legislation that passed on a straight party line vote, narrowly. Needed the vice president to weigh in at the last vote. Where on an issue like that, is that what you see that we're really not finding great solutions because we're so divided?
Well, I mean, yes, there's a lot of division, and I do think we are finding places where there's breakthrough. Now, I'm not a legislative expert, it's on infrastructure or something, maybe, you point to things like that, but I actually don't want to go that way. I'd rather talk about how an issue is framed is very important at the outset. And so if I frame the problem as climate change, it may be that I've narrowed the possibility of the conversation to be as inclusive and creative as possible, given that another part of that problem is energy access. And so how do you think about understanding an issue? And then if you're worried about energy access, then you're probably also worried about mass poverty in some parts of the world that desperately need energy. And so it's not as simple as saying the problem is this little slice of the pie, but can we look at it holistically? And I find that when you take a more holistic look, the table gets more inclusive and the solutions become neither red nor blue sometimes. So we also really involve the business community a lot in our work. We don't do that much with government, but we have a lot of roundtables that are about bringing people together from community, from business, from sort of the research world, to try to frame the issue in a new way to maybe get more fresh thinking on it.
Yeah, very helpful, particularly in that issue. That framing immediately puts people in corners if you're not careful.
But I want to call out my colleagues because they're all part of the solution too. There are certain scholars working at each of their institutions that bring real knowledge to bear. And so, the field I know is education. And Caroline Hawksby is at Hoover, and Beth Akers is at AEI, and Kevin Carey is at New America. I have no idea what party they're in. I couldn't tell you to begin with, but I've read their research, and it's really helped me learn things I didn't know about educational opportunity.
That's great. And I don't know, Anne-Marie, if you want to weigh in, maybe in terms of how this impacts U.S. foreign policy or our standing in the world as the world looks in at what they see of our politics. What does that do to our standing and credibility and soft power?
Well, I'll just start with John Stuart Mill. You cannot have a democracy without an educated citizenry, and an educated citizenry cannot actually move forward dialectically. The way we pursue knowledge, even if it's always imperfect, is to change our minds. Right? I mean, otherwise we'd still be thinking that the sun goes around the earth. And so learning how to do this, and learning how to do this in a way where we don't take it personally, which is hard. And I often think it's, if you weren't in a debating society in high school where you learned how to make these arguments, or you didn't go to law school, often it's hard to hear a challenge to what you are saying without hearing a challenge to you. And again, I think there are whole groups for whom this is particularly difficult. But it really does go to the foundations of our ability to govern ourselves. Without Shikandi, I agree with you with the sort of, oh my God, democracy is dying, but I believe deeply that there's a reason why it takes a certain level of development and a certain level of education to be able to sustain robust self-governance. Let's put it in those terms. So I think these issues are quite fundamental, they're also fundamental in terms of generating at least enough sense of commonality to keep a country together. You know, that I consider myself a patriot. That's often a dirty word in my circles, but I love the country deeply. I also want to hold it to account, and I have to feel some common cause with not all my fellow Americans, but with enough of them to believe that even if we disagree, we are members of one country and we're going to steer it together. Which takes me to the point about how this looks on the outside, and it's very visible as I travel, certainly in Europe, but also in Asia, where you know, I'm not sure we ever should have been lecturing other countries on democracy. I actually think the secret to our democracy is a measure of humility, where we recognize we don't live up to the ideals we espouse, but we do try, and we have a mechanism that recognizes when we've betrayed those ideals and we try again. But other countries are certainly looking at us often with real dismay and grief, right? That they have looked to us as a sort of anchor for democracy, and to see us as a couple of people said, you know, in a Lincolnian or Lincoln, I don't know quite what the adjective is there, but a moment really where we're looking back to the Civil War, a moment of our greatest division, that is frightening to many countries and certainly hurts our ability to rally the world right now, as President Biden is doing and trying to do with the war in Ukraine, where he's saying these are democracies versus autocracies. Yes, in parts of Asia and Europe, yes, countries agree. Many parts of Asia, Latin America, and other parts of Asia do not. I mean, just don't see that as the fight.
No, let me just say they don't see it as the fight, and I agree about humility. But I will say this: show me someplace that's doing better.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to say we're regressing to the mean. That's not my point. But you know, the fact is, we sometimes underestimate the United States ourselves. I mentioned what states and localities are doing. Part of what we try to do, or what I would try to do when I was secretary, is not just point to what Washington does, to point to our vibrant civil society. You know, that's also a part of our democracy. And when de Tocqueville came here in 1835, he talked about those voluntary associations of Americans who just wanted to do good. And he was sort of puzzled by it as a Frenchman. Well, you know, today we would know it as Rotary clubs and Boys and Girls clubs and American Red Cross. I mean, that's who we are too. And so it's important, I think, that we not undersell democracy, because I will say this: I'm about fed up with authoritarian envy. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, they build
Yes.
great airports. Oh, they get things done. Well, yes, they do. Anybody want to say zero COVID was a great idea?
Yeah.
One guy. Anybody want to say invading your neighbor with a subpar force was a good idea? One guy. So or not to mention the one-child policy, which now 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. And so I think while I want to be humble about it, I don't want to hide under a bushel either the light of democracy and what they can achieve. And I often tell a little story. You know, my ancestors were once considered 3/5 of a man in the compromise that brought about the United States of America. And there I am, and I'm standing in front of this portrait of Benjamin Franklin to be sworn in as Secretary of State, taking an oath of office to that Constitution, by the way, sworn in by a Jewish woman Supreme Court justice named Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was my neighbor. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what Ben would have thought of this. Well, you know, he would never have imagined it. And frankly, neither would I have imagined it as a little girl growing up in segregated Birmingham, or Ruth when she was just trying to get her voice heard in law school. So, you know, we also have to celebrate the progress of America, because it comes back to the fact that there is so much negative out there about our country right now that people are losing patience, they're losing faith, they're losing confidence. It's not a rose-colored glasses approach, but it is to just remind ourselves that, you know, democracy is kind of hard and it's messy. But if you got a better idea, tell me what it is.
I'm
I
just
would
gonna say
just
one
like to
thing, though.
add to that if I can, because no one can say that better than Condoleezza Rice. But the issue of lost confidence in our institutions and in the rule of law is part of the so what here. And this lost willingness to all understand the benefits and greatness of the aspiration of our founding documents. That's been lost in this antagonism. And the authoritarian envy, as I know Condi knows, that's not a left-only thing.
No,
That is emerging
certainly
on the
not.
right. And that is our problem as much as it's anybody else's problem. And it's a real problem. And I go around the country and I see people and they say things that lost hope and lost belief in what we are about. When you look at our history and what we've come through and accomplished, you want to just say, if you lose hope, then we won't be able to tackle this challenge either. So having the so what of the situation we're in is very serious if we lose confidence in our institutions.
Yeah.
And if
Let
we
me-
don't
if I-
recognize that we're underperforming our own potential, I mean, I don't agree with authoritarian envy, but we lost 1 million people to COVID and no European country came close. I mean, we could have done so much better. I mean, really, we can't pass legislation. We can't fix our bridges. I don't want to build bridges like the Chinese, God knows, but I would like to be able to fix their infrastructure.
I agree, Anne-Marie, and we shouldn't have lost so many people to COVID. But when I look at what the Chinese have done to make sure that Xi Jinping can have his coronation in a few weeks, locking people down like that, it's kind of awful.
Let me jump in here if I may. We have a
Please,
large
Naz.
audience who is listening very intently to everything we're saying. They're submitting absolutely terrific questions, which really speak to the conversation that you've all been having. And I want to just seed sort of another round of conversation. There's a sort of series of questions that I think in my mind are getting at this question about the tension between speaking across divides and balance and moderation on the one hand, but perhaps an undesirable tendency to both sidesism on the other hand, right? So there's a number of questions that kind of drive at when is it appropriate to not give people platforms? Where does sort of civil discourse, stop and end? What are the bounds of what we consider civil discourse? There's a challenging question that asks us, why do we put civil in front of the word discourse? Is that a group of elites setting the rules for what we're allowed to talk about? So let me kind of just sort of open the floor, and apologies for asking a range of questions, but there's so many good ones that I wanted to throw them out there. And Dan, if I could start with you, and then perhaps we could do a round robin there too.
Let's see. So I think that it is the responsibility of an educator to teach the conflicts, to make the conflicts be available in an impartial framework. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering a question that was asked or just making a statement, but a sort of pedagogy that factors out of the equation the reasonable conflicts, I think is not a good idea. I think it's good to empower students by knowing and being able to actually articulate arguments that are not their own, being able to listen, hear, and restate, this is what you believe, and then understand why that is believed. I think the educator's role is to facilitate that. On the question of the boundaries of permissible speech, here we can talk about limit cases, I guess, but the main thing I would argue is that colleges and universities have a responsibility to have a very wide boundary, very wide, and to tolerate, if you will, speech that some may find offensive or erroneous. At the same time, to provide a framework where those views can be questioned and not simply asserted. So there's a dialogue, and that the unpopular or offensive view is in an exchange with people that want to raise a counterargument. I trust students to be able to handle that. And I think that's better than trying to write rules that somehow protect students against offensive or even erroneous views. I'd rather that comes out in the dialogue.
Anne-Marie, would you like to weigh in on this one? And one question I'm kind of, again, elevating some of what our audience is asking us. What about when there are views that are really opinion, that are not supported in particular by science? The phrase that the questioner asked is sort of what happens when there are wacky views? And I think that's actually an appropriate word in this context.
I do. so I'll answer that question and then also comment on the student who asked about civil discourse as well. Yeah, I don't remember who said you are entitled to your opinions, but not to your own facts. And that is not always an easy line to draw, but it is certainly a possible line to draw, right? We cannot, again, we can't govern ourselves. We can't do anything if we don't actually recognize that there are facts. Now, any good scientist would tell you facts are continually being revised. That is actually, or a historian would tell you that that's that's how we advance knowledge. But you can say at any given moment, the balance of research shows this is what happened. Even for an event, and again, in law school, you're taught immediately, never trust eyewitnesses automatically because people see different things. We know that. But we can assemble the evidence and determine this is the most likely thing to have happened. So I do think that, again, as educators, universities, stewards of knowledge, advancers of knowledge, there has to be an insistence that you make your case, and that when you assert something as a fact, it is actually backed up with as much evidence as possible. And a good educator not only should be doing that herself, but should be teaching students to say, what are you basing that on? And then when the student responds, you continue to ask questions. There has to be that. It cannot be your view is equal to your view. We simply can't advance that way. The other thing, though, I will just say to the civil discourse, and I think, Fritz, you mentioned this, I want to underline the point. It doesn't mean civil as in polite, although, again, hurling insults is no way to advance knowledge. It means civil in the sense of civic space, of how we engage with one another as fellow citizens, as fellow inhabitants of the same place. And so it's vital to talk about civil discourse as a kind of discourse that has to be conducted under certain rules and assumptions, that is not the same conversation you might have around your dinner table or hanging out, even though one hopes we could improve discourse there too.
Robert, I invite you to jump in here, and I'm especially interested in your views on when, if ever, it is appropriate to deplatform someone who is bringing harmful and offensive views into a civic space, as Anne-Marie described.
Well, first of all, I think it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan that made that line about facts and opinions, and so I wanted to get that
attributed to many.
He probably borrowed from someone else, but who knows? But I'm pretty libertarian on this. I'm pretty free speech absolutist on this by and large. I would point out that, and I don't know the answer, but I do think we do have to have a conversation about Section 230 in the code concerning internet communication, because I came up before I was a public official, I was a journalist, and we operated under some constraints concerning libel. And you had to be careful, and there was a lot of care put into that, in my judgment, that is lost, I think, in the rapid communication that takes place in the new media world. And I'm not sure that repealing Section 230 is the right answer, but I do think there is a place for some way to address that issue. But you have to be very careful. We are, because then it all becomes who makes the decision, who controls, who shuts down. And I think that's unfortunate. I also would piggyback a little bit on Anne-Marie in this issue about facts and evidence. It wasn't feelings, and it wasn't, well, this is how I feel. I do think in the communication in lots of places, unsubstantiated feelings replace, a thorough review of the evidence and facts that make a case for an argument. And I think students and teachers and people in the public discussion should be very careful about that, because certainly we don't want to, shut people down, but you've got to come to the table with evidence and facts and details. You can't just say, well, I don't care what the evidence says. That makes me feel bad.
Yeah, right.
Condi,
Yeah,
please, this is very much how you started out, so please.
yes, right. Well, I agree with Bob. I'm pretty libertarian on these things, but we do have actually some rules. We don't allow incitement, for instance.
Yeah.
And I think that makes perfectly good sense.
Yeah.
In a classroom, I would never allow personalistic ad hominem attacks. If I heard a speaker stand up and just start insulting students, I would probably ask that speaker to leave the stage. So while I believe that as a general principle, I believe in the freest possible speech, there are some, let me just put it, characteristics that are so such that they will shut down the sense of civil, the sense of civic. And so we do have some rules about it. I just make another point. One of the hardest things to recognize is that other democracies, actually, we're pretty absolutist on free speech in the United States.
Yeah.
Not all democracies are.
Yeah.
The Germans have some pretty strong rules about not letting a Hitler come back to power. So we just have to recognize that that democracy and American versions of free speech are not actually synonymous. I would make only one other point about this, the question of deplatforming and so forth. It just goes back to, if you really find something disagreeable, if you really think that somebody has, just argue with them, get your facts and take it on.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, it's really quite empowering. I'll just give you one very funny little story. So we're in Birmingham, back in Denver by this time. My mother, who grew up in the segregated South, walks into a store. She asks to see some nice sweaters. The woman keeps showing her acrylics. My mother finally says, I really would like to see some natural fabrics. Okay, this is a microaggression, right? My mother looks at her and says, I want to see the nice ones, because let's be clear. If you could afford anything in here, you wouldn't be working here. Now, would you like to show me? So, sometimes a comeback's worth everything.
Yeah.
Let me kind of seed then. Thanks for that great example. Let me seed another kind of round of questions here, and then I think Fritz is going to kind of do the same. One of the things that we've sort of been skirting around a little bit, a couple of you mentioned it, but I'd like to kind of ask it explicitly, is that one dimension of the civil discourse challenge that we face today is a sort of growing generalized distrust of expertise, right? A distrust of the campus, of the professoriate, and I would sort of venture to guess that it extends to the think tank space and to the sort of elite level discourse that we're kind of, that we're all engaged in our sort of everyday lives. So a question to you about how your organizations are sort of weathering that distrust, and whether we have a responsibility to find better ways to connect with a broader audience on the work that we're doing. Let me start with Anne-Marie.
Wow. So we're living in an era of distrust of just about everything, right? We've been looking at distrust of governments for a long time. I mean, Bob Putnam was doing that work 30 years ago. And I remember Joe Nye in the sort of 2000 publishing a book about declining trust in government. And then declining trust in all institutions, and indeed in the United States, the military used to be exempt from that, less so now. Business in many cases used to be exempt, less so now. So part of this, I do think, is this era of the massive democratization of information. As Condi said, I grew up in the Walter Cronkite era too, and I'm sure Walter Cronkite wasn't right in the way that we thought he was, and I'm sure I should have been listening to more voices, but there was at least a common baseline, and then you could sort of challenge it. And when I look at what some of my children, my students, they can spend hours on the internet, and yes, those algorithms take them to more and more extreme views. It's not surprising that we see this huge rise in distrust. I do think part of this has to be rebuilt from the ground up. So here I'm completely with Condi that if you look at smaller communities, parts of cities, even some bigger cities, they are managing to once again bring people together in a way that there can be a sort of common sense of what is. We've lost local journalism. I would put a lot of money back into actually paying local reporters on local beats, ideally for debate, right? There is no one answer in smaller towns, but where people can once again think, yes, this is true. This institution, or more true than false, this institution is actually delivering, so that people can see it and then build up from there. I don't think, and I'm sitting in Washington right now, a block from the White House, but this culture, the Washington culture, really is it's a one industry town, and that industry is deeply dysfunctional in many ways. So I would say start, yes, university campuses are a great place. More than that, elementary schools, but also local communities and community journalism, and an ability to bring the community together to solve problems that are closest to the ground.
Something like the Denver Dialogues, for example.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Robert, please.
Well, I actually am a little sympathetic to, and I come to this with great humility, to those who are challenging experts. There are a number of examples in recent history that experts sort of felt, China was going to be all right. It was going to be a good member of the world community and wasn't going to take advantage of our welcoming them into the free trade world. Well, that didn't really happen. And I think people feel as if experts have tried to tell them that they have an answer to the difficulties on the border with regard to enforcing the rules of immigration. And experts haven't solved that either. I think that the effects of trade, free trade, is very much an experts thing, and some people really were hurt by some aspects of free trade. So I would never sort of associate myself with sort of telling people, oh, come on, just trust the experts or trust the elites. I trust the institutions. I trust the rule of law. I trust our founding documents. But I wouldn't, partly because AI experts, may have been some of the people that got some of that wrong. And I think we need to be conscious of that. I also would want, I like the student in the university who challenges the prevailing view, even if that prevailing view is coming from the university president's office. So that's my take on that.
Condi and Dan, would you like to weigh in on this as well?
Well, just on the expertise point, I think that experts would help themselves if they were able to distinguish between what is, quote, established fact, what is still open to revision of fact, and what is frankly just an assessment rather than a surety. So on China, that was an assessment by people. There was no way to read the minds of Chinese leaders, or most certainly Xi Jinping, and know what would happen. So experts are sometimes at fault for this, rather than saying, here is what I assess from the data that I've gotten and so forth. There's a tendency to speak with a certainty that probably is not always warranted. Yeah. It also doesn't help if experts are speaking on things on which they are not expert. Yeah. So it's my other broadside.
All of which media reinforces, right? That soundbite encourages you to say something as fact very quickly.
Exactly.
I want to add to this in support of everything that was said, but another angle on it, which is that I really value the kind of person who's able to extract the expertise from a group and be able to help people together co-create their understanding of what is it they're even working on, and then what are the different ways they might proceed. And a lot of Aspen's work is in the field, working on, with Native American youth in our major program across a number of different communities, or with out of school youth in many of our communities, or with working parents. We have a big program called Ascend, which helps working parents feel that they have agency in engaging with solutions to the problems that they understand they're having. So often experts have framed a problem without that engagement. On the other hand, the solutions are so vibrant and exciting when people come together to identify a solution. And that is what participatory democracy is all about. And those of us that could think of ourselves as experts or be called that would really do well to get out in the world on the ground and listen a lot more and draw out of people what they think the problems are.
Yeah.
I would
So,
strongly second that.
Jumping in, I mean, I think that's a challenge to us in academia. I think one of the things we try to do at Corbell School, and we don't always succeed, but is do exactly what you're suggesting, Dan, which is to talk to people who know things in the world early and often, and be part of a conversation, because there's a lot. And a lot of this is also about humility, as was said. You know, I was part of the group that imagined that free trade would lead to great things in China and in Eastern Europe, et cetera. And we were probably overconfident in that regard. And so having some humility is part of the equation too. The other thing I thought is the distinction that was made between trusting experts and trusting institutions. And you know, trust is Jan Elster, I think, has a book called "It Trust is the Cement of Society." It is, you know, trust is an enormously efficient thing if we can actually, you know, trust institutions. And there is a huge cost in our society now of the lack of trust, as you've all sort of pointed to. I know we're just about at time, and this is just an amazing conversation. We could probably go on for hours and hours, and hopefully we will pick it up again for sure. But as Naz said, in somewhat jokingly, this is what we're trying to do here in the Denver Dialogues. And I guess I'd love to ask each of you sort of, you know, by way, first of all, thanks of being part of this conversation today, but also of your institutions being part of an ongoing series of conversations. What you hope for the Denver Dialogues? What do you think we can accomplish in our, you know, in the limited form that we have in this format? What is it you think we can be doing that really is going to advance, you know, makes at least some progress on the issues that we're talking about? And we maybe we'll start with you, Dan, and come back around in reverse order where we started.
Well, I think you want to go viral and essentially seed more and more dialogue in more and more parts of the university, the school, the university, the community. You know, making dialogue something that's cool, important, and worth our time. Something that we take pride in and pleasure in is, I think, what you're about. And you know, that's why I'm so glad to be a part of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Now, I don't remember the precise order. I think maybe Anne-Marie was penultimate the first round.
So I'll piggyback on something Dan said beforehand, and which is it would be fabulous if these dialogues could, in fact, seed the ideas of what we at New America call people-centered policy, so that when we're talking about these issues, we actually engage people who are closest to them, who are, you know, if we are talking about the future of work, let's include workers. If we are talking about housing, let's talk to people who are either have been homeless or are directly working. So this idea that I do believe in expertise, but I also very much believe that we are constantly learning most from kind of ideas to action and back. But the thing I would hope for the Denver Dialogues is also that we rekindle imagination about what this country can be. You know, what we're called New America, that's because we're becoming a new America through our demography, through our technology, through our relationship to the world, in which, you know, you can't isolate or intervene against pandemics or climate change or those kinds of big global problems. And I often think we've lost our capacity to imagine possibility and potential for an extraordinary country, a country that is having real issues, and regardless of how it rates against others. But part of the answer to that is not just debate, it's dreaming.
Yeah, I love that.
So my hope is pretty
Robert.
prosaic. You know, AI is a Washington-based think tank, but doesn't like to think of it as being entirely Washington focused. Like Condi, we like to engage with people in states and localities, and we often make more progress there. Same is true for universities and universities all across America. So, you know, our scholars believe in free markets and free people and limited government and a strong American role in the world. We stand against a kind of treating people as represented by their identity as opposed to who they are as individuals. And we think our scholars' views and thoughts are needed in universities across America. So my hope is that you keep inviting AI scholars to come to Denver and participate, because that's what we're asking other universities to do as well.
We'll do that next time in Denver.
Yeah, there you go.
As convenient and wonderful as the virtual platform is, this is a lovely place to actually spend time together. Condi.
Well, first of all, I can absolutely affirm that Denver is a great place to
Yeah.
spend time, having spent a lot of my life there. And I would just say, keep doing what you're doing. I do think this has been a really stimulating conversation for me. It's funny, we all know each other. I don't think we would sit down and have this conversation. We're all very busy. We're going in different directions.
Yeah.
And so getting people to be in an environment in which they can take an hour and a half and actually talk, we don't do that enough anymore. Secondly, I would encourage bringing some younger folks along. There have been at least 3 or 4 times that the 4 of us have referred to something that my students would actually not recognize or remember. And it's while I'm not one who says, oh, young people have all of the answers. They do have a very different context. They've grown up in a world in which many of the verities that we hold true were already in question, and perhaps by the time they were conscious, they were really under attack. And so I think as the dialogues progress, getting their voices, particularly we're a university, getting their voices will be very important. And then finally, as it progresses, I think you can go to harder and harder topics. I would really encourage the Denver dialogues not to be shy about bringing up the topics that people might get a little hot under the collar, to the point of civil doesn't mean polite, to the point that people might be a little uncomfortable. Civil doesn't mean not being offended, because ultimately we have to move from being in our comfort zone where we can agree about generalities about civil discourse to the point that we can actually start to put our data on the table, our assumptions on the table, our hopes and our fears on the table, and talk openly. And perhaps by the time you've been through the whole series, it'll be possible to do that.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for both the support, but also the challenges you put in front of us. I think it is our aspiration to take on some hard issues. This has been civil in all senses in this conversation, and there are going to be issues where there is strong disagreement, and we need to be able to tackle those. And also to the point about bringing in other voices, younger voices, people who are actually experiencing the things we're talking about, not just those of us. Let me, so thank you for all of those thoughts. Naz, I wanted to ask you if you have some closing thoughts and reflections, if you'd like to offer those, and then we are just about at time.
Yeah, thank you, Fritz. An enormous thank you to each of you for being here and for your support, the overall initiative. I think we did a nice job of being as spicy as we could today, to use Condi's word. But we look forward to, as you were all just kind of pointing to having these difficult conversations moving ahead. And we're very grateful to your institutions for agreeing to embark on this with us. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
And let me just echo that. Thanks again for being part of it. We are looking forward to the next installation. We will probably not this particular group again, but we'll be drawing on your colleagues at the think tanks, some of whom might be younger, and having conversations about major issues, and ones in which there are in our society sharp disagreement. And our hope very much is that we'll be able to demonstrate, as we did to some extent in the kind of low spice environment that we were in today, the ways in which we can actually discuss. I don't like the word debate these days. Unfortunately, debate has become a kind of scoring point thing, but actually have a conversation where the real point is to find the truth is to bring evidence to bear. And as I said, as one of you said at the beginning, that the ability to be persuaded, I think Emery, you might have said that, you know, and to come to conversations with it's risky, you know, we don't like to open ourselves to the possibility we might have to change our mind. But if we can demonstrate that there exists some evidence that could change our mind and have a conversation, have conversations that demonstrate that, I think they're real value. In any event, we are really looking forward to continuing this series with all of you and your institutions. And thank you again for being a part of it. And thanks to all of you in the audience who've stayed with us. I apologize. We're so many good questions and so little time, but we will try to pick up on some of those questions as we proceed in the series. And with that, I wish you all a great day and happy discourse.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.